Shabbat Shalom. The year is 1440, and the place is a tiny German town called Mainz. And an unsuspecting goldsmith named Johannes is working on an invention that will soon change the world. What did he do? He took a simple wine press and fitted it with movable metal type, and he used a special recipe of oil-based ink, and thus the Gutenberg printing press was born. Now, in a world of iPhones and tablets and a 24-hour news cycle, this invention might not wow us so much today, but the invention of the Gutenberg printing press created a media firestorm that directly led to what we now call the Renaissance. Let me explain. Less than a generation later after his invention, still in Germany, a young Catholic monk named Martin is noticing a big problem within his local Christian community. Nobody knows what's actually in the Christian Bible. Why? Well, because in the early 1500s, most of the Bibles in existence were still being handwritten, usually by monks or hermits, and because of this, these Bibles would have been extremely rare, very precious, and therefore extremely expensive, leaving them out of the hands of the average European Catholic at the time. Now remember that amazing printing press I mentioned earlier? It's true that Johannes Gutenberg ends up printing a Bible, but he does so in Latin, a language that most people in Germany don't speak at the time. Meaning that if you actually wanted to know what was in your Holy Bible, you'd have to go and talk to official church clergy about it. And wouldn't you know it, the Catholic fathers, popes, and church leaders of the time weren't too keen on having that conversation with the everyday layman. Perhaps the reason they weren't so fond of having a biblical discussion was because the things that the church was instituting and doing at the time were not in the Bible. For example, let's talk about the other thing our friend Martin was having a problem with: indulgences. An indulgence was a official remission of punishment for sins, and many church officials were selling them on the street out of a wagon to anyone who could afford one. Really, it was just a piece of paper that you could buy from your local priest or monk, guaranteeing you a spot in heaven or a quick exit out of purgatory for your loved one for a cost. Martin thought this practice was wrong. It had no biblical basis at all, and people were being led to believe they could essentially pay money to reduce the punishment for their sins. To combat this, Martin, or Martin Luther as we know him now, wrote a doctrine criticizing indulgences, a manifesto which historians would come to call the 95 Theses. And he famously nailed this treaty to the door of his local Catholic church. Oi. Now typically, heretics like Martin Luther would have been dealt with rather swiftly. A quick burning at the stake usually quelled little rebellions like these, but church officials have a big problem now. That recently invented printing press is cranking out copies of Luther's 95 Theses and distributing them all over Europe. And for the first time in a long time, the people now have access to an honest critique of the Catholic Church that's rooted in biblical proof. Oi, again. If they kill Martin Luther outright, that will only stir the pot more. So what do? What they always do, they excommunicate him. He goes into hiding at a place called Wartburg Castle, which is in modern-day Germany. He goes into exile. He changes his name. He grows a long beard so no one will know who he is. And what is Luther's first act of business now that he's been officially kicked out of the church? He does something very interesting. He translates the complete Christian Bible from Latin into German, giving the people their first copy of a holy text that they can actually read on their own, in their own language, and more importantly, a copy they can actually afford. And friends, this is where the printing press really changes things. Because now adherents to the Catholic faith, they no longer need a monk or a priest or pope to tell them what's in their Bible. They can now read it for themselves. This series of events led to something that we now call the Protestant Reformation, and it is remarkable to me to think that it all began with an idea that people should be able to access a holy text. This idea is mentioned in our Parshat for the week, Parshat Shoftim, where God commands to the Jewish people that if they elect a king, quote, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this Torah. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life so that he may learn to be in awe of Adonai his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not feel superior to his brethren or to turn from the law from the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time in the midst of Israel. Very interesting mitzvah. The reason I think it's so fascinating is because even from the offset, Jewish tradition knows how important it is to have access to a holy text. Apparently, this idea is so important that the king, according to the Torah, is supposed to write a Torah scroll for himself and have a copy of that holy text with him forever. The Torah wanted to ensure that the person responsible for running our kingdom was familiar with all of its laws, stories, decrees, and ideas contained within it, so they couldn't plead ignorance if they decided to abandon or disobey it. It goes without saying that Jews have always carried the label, quote, the people of the book. And if you look at our track record, one could make an argument that Jews have had access to our holy books way before Gutenberg's printing press or even the Renaissance itself. For instance, in the book of Nehemiah, towards the end of the Tanakh, we're introduced to a man called Ezra the scribe. We're told that Ezra gathered all of the people of Jerusalem together, and he stood before them with a Torah scroll, now complete, and he read from it publicly so that the entire community could hear it together. This event was so important and so unifying that it would later become a central part of Jewish life. I mean, we just did that a moment ago. We read Torah publicly. Unlike in other religions, access to holy Jewish scrolls were pretty common in the ancient world, and Jews could hear public Torah readings even as early as the Second Temple period. The Torah was not hidden away for a group of religious elites. Rather, it belonged to the entire community. Eventually, rabbinic Jewish texts would also enter the world of printing. That printing press really helped us a bunch. The Talmud, which had been copied by hand for centuries, could suddenly now be reproduced and distributed on a massive scale, which made way for the famous copy of the Talmud, which was printed in Vilna. This is usually referred to as the Vilna Shas. And that document, that series of books, becomes one of the most influential printed editions of rabbinic literature forever. Friends, something extraordinary happens when these texts become accessible. They create community. For the first time, a Jew in Vilna could study a page of Talmud, and a Jew somewhere else could be studying that same page, even though they were worlds away. They were still connected through ideas. And I think that is what it means to be a people of the book. It's incredibly beautiful how we cling to our texts. If you ever watch somebody parade the Torah around, they carry a Torah like they would carry their beloved child close to them. We want our texts copied. We want our texts printed. We want our text translated, taught, and shared. And I think most importantly, we're not afraid of what happens when people actually read our texts. Because once you give people access to a text, you give them the ability to question it, challenge it, disagree with that. And we Jews really like this concept. I mean, just look at the Talmud, where opposing opinions are preserved side by side for generations. Jews do not suppress difficult ideas. We put them on the table and we wrestle with them. We don't silence disagreement. We make it a part of our tradition. During these upcoming high holidays, we will all open our machzors, our prayer books, and we'll hear the words that Jews have been singing and praying for thousands of years. We will hear the Torah, we'll hear the shofar, the ancient prayers, and we will encounter the same texts that our ancestors carried with them for generations. But the question is not simply whether the text will be available to us. The question is whether we will make ourselves available to the text. Friends, it's one thing to own a siddur or a machzor, but it's quite another thing to open it. It's one thing to hear Torah being read, but it's quite another thing to let it speak to you. Because I think the miracle of Jewish texts is not simply that they just survived, it's that they kept finding a new audience in every new generation. Ezra read from the Torah to a community thousands of years ago. And then the sages argued over that Torah, and the scribes copied it, and the printers spread it, and eventually those same words made their way to us. And now it's our turn. Our job is not simply to preserve the tradition, but to engage with it, to wrestle with it, to pass it on, to keep the conversation going with our texts, with our tradition, and with the people in our lives. And hopefully, we can avoid the little danger that comes with being a people of the book, that sometimes we are so proud of owning it that we forget to actually read it. So in conclusion, dear friends, our tradition has never been afraid of giving us access to our holy texts, and throughout history, those texts inspired everyone, from peasants to kings to reformers to priests. Our texts have the ability to change lives and to change the world, even if only one word at a time. So as we approach this high holiday season, let's not just open our book. Let's open ourselves to it. Shabbat Shalom.